Oh, welcome, Kate. Thank you so much for joining us here. I have been admiring your work in AI for a very long time, and I'm really happy that you could come and share with us your thoughts about this subject. You've been studying energy resources and AI for a very long time, and I would like to know what brought you to these questions.
Well, of course, artificial intelligence as a field is often very narrowly and technically prescribed. It focuses on algorithms, on mathematical approaches, on the cloud, and there's been generally very little discussion or research on its material imprints. And so that has been something that has been the center of my work for the last 7 years. And to really understand the materiality of artificial intelligence required going to the places of its extraction. So I've traveled to mines around the world to study the supply chains of lithium and rare earth, and then to look at the energy requirements for planetary scale artificial intelligence, which, as we know, are vast and growing. So with the new approaches in artificial intelligence like generative AI, these are even more energy intensive than the previous discriminative AI forms. So part of my work really is tracing what we can know, but also tracing what we don't know. And of course, one of the things that's most troubling about this field is that so much of the data around energy use is kept as the most guarded corporate secrets. So sometimes this means having to do FOIA requests, going to physical sites to sort of track their energy and water usage patterns for data centers. It's very empirical work in that sense.
I'm in particular interested in the questions of full supply chains of natural resources and AI. What have you recently learned? What are the new developments in this field?
Oh, that's a great question. And, certainly for my last book, Atlas of AI, it was really developing a sort of a typology of the full resource stack of artificial intelligence. So, in my thinking around this area is certainly that AI is really the extractive industry of the 21st century. It relies on vast amounts of data, hidden human labor, and natural resources. And we can break that into different domains. We can talk about energy, we can talk about water, and we can talk about minerals. So we really sort of have to think about it in this sort of tripartite way. But certainly the full stack now is starting to shift. And one of the things that I found really interesting is looking at the chipsets that are being used to drive generative AI. So right now, of course, Taiwan is at the center of the world's attention and at the center of geopolitical AI production because it really is the hub for semiconductor manufacturing. And so we can look at NVIDIA's chips, the H100 and the A100. Currently, there's a global shortage of these chips because they're in such high demand. So all of the large tech companies have at least 200 to 300,000 of these chips running their AI stacks. But each one of these chips has an extraordinarily energy-intensive production cycle. We can look to the global wafer production that's produced by TCSM, also in Taiwan. This is hugely energy-intensive to produce these wafers because of the high precision tooling needed to make them. And again, it's always energy and water paired. So in the case of TCSM, they use around 60,000 gigaliters of water per day, and that's around 10% of the two major water reservoirs, which also essentially create the public water supply for residents. And that's 10% of each reservoir, so that's an enormous amount of water. And that sort of sets the scene from the beginning of the full stack of AI as we sort of trace down. You can think about the chipsets, then we go into the creation of the data centers and all of the hardware and water needed to cool it, which is extraordinary. And then through deployment, when these models are actually facing us and we're sitting there with our text boxes and typing in prompts, here too is an enormous amount of energy. So this is, for me, part of the sort of the process of critical cartography in AI. Is like, how do we map and trace all of these points in which these enormous energy guzzling systems are functioning and where they're drawing on supplies. And the interesting thing, of course, is that, again, so little of this is publicly reported.
And can you tell us a little bit more about new developments in green computing? Because, of course, there's a lot of conversation about the fact that in general, computing industry, computer technologies are creating about 2% of the carbon footprint. Probably it's higher, but the most recent calculations are about that. And there are many attempts to already, like, obviously think about, on the one hand, how much carbon footprint is generated by this industry and how to reduce it, how to create more energetically sustainable technologies, and also how to take care of the electronic waste. So what are the newest developments that you are aware of?
Well, it's interesting because right now the tech industry is slightly behind aviation, but only very slightly in terms of its full carbon footprint. But because of its growth rates, which are exponential at the moment, it is predicted to actually lap aviation very shortly. So there's a lot of attention on how to make computing greener. But it's an extremely dirty supply chain. Again, if I think of projects that I've done, like Anatomy of an AI System, we were really sort of tracing where the waste products go from so many of these systems. And you can actually go and see them. You can go to Batu in Mongolia and see these vast lakes that are 5 miles wide. I mean, these are just gigantic black lakes of toxic mud that are produced from mining all of the rare earth. Because, of course, rare earth is quite common in the Earth's crust, but the practice of extraction is extremely waste intensive. So you have not just the kind of tailings, but you also have an enormous amount of radioactive slurry that's produced in rare earth mining that end up in these artificial lakes. I mean, again, you see the imprints on the earth all the way through the supply chain. So in terms of the things that I've seen that I'm excited about, right now we're looking at sort of different model designs in large language modeling. And there's a new open source model called Bloom that was actually only using around 5% of the energy that was used to train GPT-3. We don't know GPT-4 because, of course, it's become another black box. They've released nothing about how it was produced. But for GPT-3, we know a few things. And what Bloom did, which is interesting, is that they didn't use any of the traditional coal and gas energy pipelines to train this system because it was all trained in France. So they ended up using nuclear. Now that meant that it was a much sort of cleaner sort of net training process for Bloom. But then, of course, we have all of the questions that nuclear raises. And certainly it always makes me think of Peter Gallison's work in his fantastic documentary Containment, where he traces the waste for nuclear energy production. And it's still something that we don't have answers for. And I know that one of the things for this conference is focusing on how this could be done differently and done better. But at the moment, we don't have those solutions. So even in the case of Bloom, so-called green AI, I think, hides a different story. And it really requires sort of unearthing and excavating all of those full stack supply chain questions to really start to assess if something is green or not.
And what is your biggest concern about energy and AI?
Honestly, my biggest concern about energy and AI is that people aren't talking about it, that it's assumed that this is, somehow a clean technology that's, just operating in the background, in a cloud server with no impact on the environment whatsoever. In fact, generally speaking, when people talk about AI, it's because it will be used to somehow solve the climate crisis. People say, oh yes, AI will take care of this, when actually it's contributing to all of the things that we're most concerned about environmentally right now. So I think that the thing that's undergirding a lot of this is just effectively the problems of secrecy. So at the moment, what is being published around energy usage is very general from the tech sector, and there's very little sort of precise information. Again, because partly there's concerns that this will be a competitive advantage to know how much energy is being used. But honestly, the numbers are just going up and up and up. That's all we know, is that there's just like a huge energy demand, particularly for generative models. So, and the same is true of water. There we have a few more sources of information, which is fantastic, but what we're seeing is that the amount of water need to cool these gigantic data centers is extreme. A recent paper, in fact, estimated that every exchange you have with GPT, you're on ChatGPT talking about, something that's interesting to you that day, just as to, effectively to play, and those games that we play with GPT are the equivalent of pouring out a liter of fresh water on the ground for every exchange, just because of the amount of cooling that's done in servers. So it really casts a different pall on what we're doing here, and what these LLMs and large language models are actually doing to the planet more generally. So I think my concern is that if we pull away the curtain and you start to see the full stack resource implications, they're pretty horrifying. And it does require the industry to rethink how it's actually creating artificial intelligence from the large-scale training data sets that drive these models through to essentially the embodied carbon in everything from the chipsets to the full builds to the actually deployed models.
We can only imagine what's going to happen with quantum computing when this is going to be essentially on a very different level. And are there already any conversations even about how we might be prepared for that?
Agnieszka, I think that will be the topic for the next conference. It's such a big one, but I know you and I find that really interesting. And certainly some of the conversations about quantum are really focusing on will it really shift the sort of energy equation in a positive direction for us? And it's too soon to call, clearly. But it's certainly fascinating because I think so many of the ways of thinking about how AI is made materially are going to change. So, as we say, that might be the conference for 2035. What do you think?
I think so. Thank you so much, Kate, for joining us.
Such a pleasure.
Thank you.